What happens when one of the key designers of Civilization 2, Colonization and Alpha Centauri forms his own game studio and decides to make an RTS? Well, if today's topic is anything to go by, something quite remarkable. Hi, I'm Calvin, and today we're going to take a look at Rise of Nations, talk a little about its design and try to get to the bottom of what makes it work. Rise of Nations was published by Microsoft back in 2003. It was the flagship title of the recently founded studio Big Huge Games, and something that took the best part of 3 years to design and develop. Big Huge was founded by Brian Reynolds, who by the year 2000 was already well established in the industry, having worked as a programmer and designer since 1992. I've already mentioned some of his credits in the intro, but I think for comedic effect it's worth highlighting that his first big studio release was Rex Nebula and the Cosmic Gender Bender, a point-and-click adventure from Microprose that is described as a puzzle-solving adventure game with light erotic and comedy elements. Anyway, Big Huge wasn't exactly sure what it intended to create. It had a multi-game deal with Microsoft, but without any specifics in mind. They started out with a brainstorming session, simply listing all the things they thought would be cool in a real-time game and using that as a basis for their design. Now, before we get too far in, it's hard to talk about Rise of Nations without making some comparisons to Empire Earth, as both span the course of human history and essentially hybrids between RTS and 4X. What I find interesting is that both games were arrived at from a totally different direction. Empire Earth was created by someone with an RTS background, the designer of Age of Empires, while Rise of Nations was created by someone with a 4X background, the Civilization series. Now, by all accounts, Brian Reynolds is a pretty decent sort of chap, and someone who is a pleasure to talk to. This is of some benefit to us, as it resulted in a lot of interviews, so we actually have a bit more information about the whole design and development process than we do for many other games. In a 2004 interview, he is asked about where he thinks the RTS genre is headed, and he replies, "Well, I think one of the complaints I've heard most about the RTS genre from the marketplace and players and reviewers alike is that there isn't enough innovation. This really struck a chord with me, as it is a well-recognised problem these days that has plagued the genre for years, and here is Brian commenting on the same thing 2 decades ago." Brian cared about gameplay and innovation, but pacing was also really important. They didn't start off with a big list of historical ages that they wanted to pack into a game, but instead decided how long a game should be and let that determine the level of detail they included. One thing I like about Brian is that he's both a designer and a programmer, and as such used a huge amount of technical prototyping when coming up with new features. Rather than spending weeks discussing a certain idea or writing pages and pages of theory crafting, they would instead implement a basic version of the idea into the evolving game engine and just see if it worked or not. Playtesting new ideas this way really allows you to understand how things are going to shape up in the final product, and generally results in strong gameplay elements that interact well with each other. The whole team also knew how to play to their strengths. Many of them had experience working on turn-based strategy games. It was something they had a deep understanding of, and is the reason why Rise of Nations features so many concepts that would traditionally be confined to grand strategy and 4X games. So, what is Rise of Nations anyway? As we mentioned earlier, it's an RTS with grand strategy elements that covers the entirety of human history. If this sounds like something else you've played, then we're back to Empire Earth again, a comparison that's pretty much unavoidable at this point. However, both games are very different, and although Empire Earth was released around 18 months before Rise of Nations, I don't think it was much of an influence on it. You see, both games had something in the region of a 3-year development cycle, so the latter would have been well on the way by the time Empire Earth arrived on the scene. You've also got to remember that games covering large periods of human history are nothing new. By this time we'd already seen 3 games in the Civ series and several other games that were either inspired by or tried to copy the formula. But onto the game. Anyone familiar with games like Age of Empires will immediately be comfortable with the opening scenes of Rise of Nations. You start off with a central building, it can produce citizens, and once created they can go out to work and start gathering all of the usuals associated with the first stages of greatness. However, it doesn't take long to realise that everything is a little bit different. Rather than direct your denizens to an assortment of trees, berries and rock piles, you instead establish some very basic infrastructure. Rise of Nations picks a slightly more recognisable start point for your budding empire, something that it refers to as the Ancient Age, and as such you've already got access to farms, quarries and logging camps. It's a pretty self-explanatory system. If you want iron, you build a quarry on a hill, and if you want wood, you place a lumber camp down by a bunch of trees. Each mountain or area of forest can only host a single camp, but the larger and more dense the location, the more citizens that particular camp can support. Farms are a little more traditional in gaming terms. You build one, assign a citizen, and they will dig the land and start producing food after a short period of construction. Most of this stuff must take place within the borders of a city, so once you've maxed out the gathering potential, then your next move is to find more fertile ground close by and erect a new city. This is where the game takes its first cues from grand strategy, as rather than operating a single base, your empire is composed of multiple settlements spread out all over the game area, with each one being an important part of your economy and infrastructure. Many of the game's important structures, like universities and temples, have a 1 per city limit, so expanding your number of settlements is the only way to get a greater benefit from these buildings. As your empire grows, so do its borders, a feature that has many other interactions ranging from diplomacy to combat. Slightly later in the game, you're allowed to build markets, which give you access to caravans, a key component of wealth generation. These units travel between pairs of cities and generate an important gold-like currency used for many units and upgrades. The more cities you own, the more trade routes you can establish and the higher your income will become. Each city can have a trade route to every other city, so it has a sort of multiplicative effect, with each new city adding a lot more trade potential. 2 cities support 1 trade route, 3 support 3, and 4 support 6, and 5 support 10, and so on. So now you've got your food, lumber, iron and wealth, well, what do you do with it? Well, one avenue is advancement. You generate a small number of research points over time, something that can be increased by the creation of universities and populating them with scholars. You can then use these research points, along with a sizable amount of other resources, to advance your military, economic, civic and science trees. Once you've researched all 4, you can then spend a little more and advance to the next stage, unlocking lots of new units, structures and upgrades. You can also build several city improvement structures like granaries, lumber mills and smelters. These are all dual purpose, so constructing one in a particular city will increase the resource generation of the related type for that settlement. Plus you can research empire-wide upgrades from those buildings which affect all of the resource gathering efforts in that category. The game's growth and improvement system has lots of built-in checks and balances to prevent you from going too far down a particular road without the right amount of supporting infrastructure. You can't expand your resource income past a certain point until the right level of economics research is completed, and the number of cities you build and your overall population is limited by your military and civ research. It isn't overly or frustratingly restrictive, but it does mean that your empire grows at a sensible and steady pace and prevents a lot of all-in low-tech strategies. It serves the game well, and it really enhances the 4x turn-based aspects of gameplay. If you're feeling a little exposed, there are keeps and castles that can be constructed to secure your borders. They are not expensive or time-consuming to build, and they do provide a decent level of protection against probing attacks. When you feel the need for a little more or want to go and crush your next-door neighbour, that's when your military might must be built. For the first few ages, this consists of infantry, cavalry, artillery and ships, built at the barracks, stables, workshop and docks. There are several units available in each category, and they have the usual rock, paper, scissors style of interactions that generally mean you need a good mix to perform well. However, it's not enough to build a big wedge of troopers and run towards the French. Unsupported, your units take a decent amount of damage over time while in enemy territory, something that limits them to very short and sharp engagements. If you intend to spend any time there, you need to build supply wagons to accompany your force. These prevent the attritional damage and also boost the firing rate of nearby artillery. It's a slightly odd mechanic, but one that started to make a great deal of sense to me the more I played. An army marches on its stomach, and without such support tends to disintegrate pretty quickly. It also brings together the territory system and explains why you don't have the option to surround yourself by walls and palisades. In Rise of Nations, you don't have to worry about half a dozen light horsemen running around the back of your base terrorising your citizens, as they can just hide inside the city while the raiders starve to death if they try to stick around too long. It also makes it very risky trying to strike too deep inside your opponent's territory, as losing your supply wagons can put your army in serious trouble. It tends to keep the initial fighting to border skirmishes, and then to slow advancements as you push forward and capture territory, rather than a mad dash to trample your opponent's juicy centre. It's a different way to play, and yet another reason why Rise of Nations has so much in common with the 4X games that influenced it. There are 8 ages in total, and each advancement is often only 10 minutes between them. This means that each new attack or major battle often feels very different from the last, so if your longbows and trebuchets failed, then maybe it's time to come back a little later with muskets and cannons. The advancements come to a close in the information age, something akin to modern day. So, although you won't see any laser-firing combat walkers, you will have access to main battle tanks and helicopter gunships, as well as the ever-lovable but equally harrowing nuclear strike option. The advancements do feel quite significant, and it's nice that the economic side keeps up with the military options. Your resource infrastructure buildings take on more modern feel as you progress. Oil becomes available later in the game and your caravans convert from horse-drawn to automotive. The look and feel of your cities, citizens and supportive structures all take on new forms as each age is unlocked. Your castles become fortresses and your towers become bunkers, so everything seems to match up nicely. I've got the Gold Edition, which includes the Thrones and Patriots expansion, and as such has quite a lot of content packed in. The main single-player campaign is an open-ended world conquest sort of affair, with a turn-based system between missions that has you making diplomatic pacts, collecting bonuses and attacking territories, with all of the results determined by the real-time battles. The battles themselves vary depending on the strategic action. The simpler ones are resolved by a shorter attack or defense missions, while the grander motions are decided by longer and more open games. The AI appears to be a perfectly serviceable opponent, so the one-off skirmish battles are also quite a lot of fun. And there's a lot of customization available for this game mode, so you can quickly set up something specific to your tastes. Like its 4X cousins, there are also plenty of game modes that don't rely on conquest for victory. Some are set up for empire victories based on things like the amount of wonders you construct, and there's even one that outright bans all military elements and focuses entirely on economy. There is also something a bit unexpected in terms of the Armageddon clock. Basically, if everyone launches too many nukes, then the world turns into a big irradiated fireball and everyone is defeated. I guess this is what you get when your game designers grew up during the Cold War. The game also has the usual multiplayer modes and selection of challenges for you to try, although I won't go into any detail there because I've not had any chance to look at them. Suffice to say, there's a lot to experience and it certainly isn't a game you could exhaust over the course of a week, but rather one you can keep going back to time and time again. Rise of Nations also includes a fully featured scenario editor for when you want to get really creative. You can start with a randomly generated map based on some initial criteria or build something from the ground up. You would need to invest a lot of time to get the most out of it, but it has a full script editor and I'm pretty sure the sky's the limit with what you could achieve. It looks like there were plenty of talented people out there with a love for Rise of Nations, and I found hundreds and hundreds of custom scenarios available for download. I did run into a few minor problems. I think the hardest thing to get to grips with was the control of the military forces. Depending on the particular stance you give them, your units have a tendency to either run off and get defeated piecemeal, or stand still while the enemy runs past them and breaks all of your catapults. Once I enabled the advanced combat options, this did get a little easier, but I found I had to do a lot more micromanaging than I would have liked for a game of this style. Half of the problem was due to my own colour blindness, making it a bit difficult to pick out the differences between my red dudes and the opponent's green dudes, a failing of many games of this period. There's also quite a bit of a learning curve when it comes to making a decisive military action. If things are going well, then resources are plentiful and the restriction is the pop cap, so it takes a decent amount of practice to figure out the best way to turn a strong advantage into an actual victory. This is something I really struggled with, and although I'm putting it down to my own ignorance and inexperience, I did find that many of my battles had very long periods of stalemate which had a tendency to dull the experience a little. If I was to make one proper criticism, it would be the lack of any storage single-player campaign. I do like the open worldly conquest part of the game, but I think I would have enjoyed something a little dramatic and engaging to get me involved in the whole experience in the first place, even if it was just a handful of missions that led me into the main game. The tutorial did serve as a good introduction, and I really enjoyed the learn as you play style of teaching that it involved, but I'm a sucker for a few cutscenes and staple RTS missions and would have welcomed something along those lines. If I was to make two criticisms, then the second would be that all of the nations feel a bit similar. Although they vary aesthetically and they've got different bonuses, aside from that you mostly play the game the same way no matter what you choose. It's true that each nation does feature a few unique units, but it's not enough to really change your strategy or method between them. But hey, you can't have everything, and all in all, Rise of Nations is a thoroughly enjoyable and feature-packed experience that deserves a lot of praise. Looking back at the game from 2024, they made a really smart choice when it came to graphical style. Although the units are fully real-time 3D, all of the buildings are pre-rendered and as such still look really nice 20 years on. They also kept the animations pretty basic, which along with all of the pre-rendering really helped the frame rate and allowed them to offer a decent level of zoom, one that's not just appropriate but almost necessary to control a game of this scope and scale. This is one of the biggest problems I had when revisiting the first Empire Earth game. The graphics had aged badly and the small viewpoint made it really hard to understand what was going on, not to mention control it. So, I've spent the last few weeks playing both Rise of Nations and the first two Empire Earth games, and I'm sure you're dying to know which one was the better game. Well, I don't think that's something I can really answer. They all have different styles and features, and it's very clear from the comments I get that different people look for different things in a game. One man's overcomplexity is another man's depth, and what some people call problems, others call character. The sheer variation of what matters to people is remarkable, with some preferring one game over the other not because of any gameplay loop or design choice, but because of a particular unit, art or animation. There is also some sort of intrinsic imprint bias, where the first one of these sorts of games you played leaves a mark on you as the right way to do it, and later games never feel quite right. These games were also released years apart, so although I can't tell you which one was the best game, I can tell you which one I would recommend and which one I'll be playing tomorrow, and that's Rise of Nations. I love RTS, and I love 4X, and for me it's got the best blend of both. It all fits together in a way that makes sense to me, and I can experience the full course of history in a single game. On top of that, it works flawlessly today. It still looks great, and the only thing I had to do to get it working on my modern PC was to change the default resolution in a config file. I did enjoy playing it, but Empire Earth felt like an ambitious but clumsy attempt to try and make a deeper version of Age of Empires. It crammed in far too many half-cooked ideas, many of which don't gel together, and the restrictive viewport and the terrible AI were serious limiting factors. This doesn't make it unimpressive. It can still be a lot of fun, especially when you consider Scenario Maker, but I think it's a far better sandbox than it is a complete game. Empire Earth 2 is an altogether tighter and more refined experience, but still struggles to find the best midpoint between the two genres that it's trying to blend. Rise of Nations does not suffer from these sorts of problems, and I think the creators' background in the Civ series really helped them understand what 4X elements are important and how their implementation in an RTS should work. I also think that their prototype-heavy design process resulted in a product where all of the individual features not just work, but complement each other in a way that's both satisfying and enjoyable. So, if you enjoyed Rise of Nations back in the day and wonder if it's still worth playing, then yes, it totally is, and you should absolutely go and do that. You can even dig out your old CDs if you've got them, they'll work just fine. If you've not played it before and fancy giving it a try, then I highly recommend that too. Big Huge Games did an absolutely cracking job on Rise of Nations, and it totally deserves all of the ratings and accolades it's earned over the years. It's deep, feature-rich, exceptionally well designed and a huge amount of fun, and we've not even mentioned the soundtrack yet, which is also top-notch and serves as an excellent backdrop to the game. Most importantly, it wasn't just another iteration of CNC, Warcraft, Starcraft or Age of Empires, but something completely different, and that in itself is something to celebrate. Brian Reynolds knew that RTS needed innovation all the way back in the early 2000s, and that's exactly what he did. I don't know about you, but I think we could use a few more people like Brian in the industry today. Hi there, thanks for experiencing this slightly longer than usual presentation. If you enjoyed this video, then click the like button, and if you've got Rise of Nations related experiences to share, then please do so in a comment or on the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.